All right, welcome everybody to History 311 Online, and this week's video lecture, we're calling it Nativism During the Great War and the Roaring Twenties, Part 1. As I've mentioned before, we're studying war this semester in American history, not as a separate entity under the rubric of military history, that is the study of battles and leaders, but rather war as something that integrates itself into the very fabric of American society and life. War changes America in ways that are often unanticipated, unexpected, sometimes unwelcomed. And so it is that phenomenon that we study here in Unit 2 of the course as we look at what contemporaries call the Great War, what we know as World War I, a conflict that was unprecedented for its destruction, its human cost, its sheer violence, and which really was the harbinger now of a modern age of great wars. Though it was sometimes referred to by contemporaries as the war to end all wars, that unfortunately did not prove to be the case. So we want to understand World War I in the context of American society and American life, to see the rather remarkable changes wrought by this foreign conflict on American society. And to get our bearings here, we recall that America was, at the time of World War I, a nation undergoing a great social transformation in the age of immigration, when 32 out of 92 million Americans by 1910 were either first or second generation immigrants. 32 out of 92 million, so more than a third of America's population had either come here from another country or were born to those who had come from another country. And as we look here at the wartime poster, remember your first thrill of American liberty. Your duty, buy U.S. government bonds, what was called the Liberty Loan. This was a fundraising mechanism used by the U.S. government during World War I to support the war effort through the solicitation of funds, so-called war bonds. But notice the particulars here of the immigrant ship, the immigrants standing at the rail of the ship, casting their first glance on liberty, their first thrill of American liberty. This was a message directed squarely at this population we're speaking of immigrant Americans. And so it's our first signal, our first clue that somehow the meaning of this war in America will be tied up with that social transformation. Laying out some questions now that we'll be covering in both Part 1 and Part 2 of this lecture. First up, what is nativism in American history? It's a key thematic concept that we're going to be exploring. How did nativism influence American attitudes toward World War I? In what sense did nativism during World War I lead to big government in America? Big government, something that's been a constant bone of contention, if you will, in our political culture for many years. In many respects has its origins in World War I. What effect did nativist views have on civil liberties during the war? Civil liberties, those constitutional rights that Americans hold dear. How did nativism continue to influence American culture after the war? And that will be the subject of this lecture, Part 2. So we begin with nativism during the Great War. World War I begins in August of 1914 in Europe. But here in America, as you may know, and as your textbook points out, there is no declaration for war. America proclaims itself instead neutral. And to begin to understand why the United States remained aloof from the conflict, we have to understand the issues that are germane here to the United States on the eve of war. The photograph shows a Ku Klux Klan rally in 1915 in Fulton County, Georgia. And as the caption says, after a long absence, the Klan was reformed in 1915 in Georgia, touting the slogan Native White Protestant Supremacy. When last we saw the Klan, it was Reconstruction, and the federal government had determined to basically destroy the organization. It had been formed by Confederate military veterans after the Civil War as a kind of homegrown terrorist organization meant to terrorize the freedmen, to keep the freed people from claiming rights or aspiring to equality. But as it is reborn now in the age of World War I, the new Klan will broaden its concerns. No longer simply a Southern organization dedicated to the segregation and inequality of black Americans, the Klan will now essentially cast a broad net of discrimination against all non-white Protestant Christian people in the country, particularly immigrants in this age of immigrants. Those immigrants now, non-native English speakers, non-Western European, coming from Southern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and even Asia. The Klan really positions itself as a kind of a defense, national defense organization, defending America against what it considers to be the disease of foreignness and foreign ideas and foreign cultures and languages and such. So a much more equal opportunity type of bigotry, and no longer simply in the South. The Klan will claim chapters throughout the Midwest and even the Far West, here in California, for example, and will recruit not just young men, or the stereotypical angry young white male, but in fact whole families. The Klan will literally hire a public relations firm to sell its image to the American people as a kind of middle-of-the-road, Main Street America, civic, almost civic organization. But the thing about this wave of nativism that we're going to be looking at, this reaction to all things foreign by those who consider themselves natives, and we mean here, of course, not Native Americans in the sense of the American Indian, but native white Protestant Americans, that this nativism wasn't limited only to the Klan. You might consider the margins of society, but rather, in this case, even the President of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson, commenting here on what he called hyphenated Americans. Let me read this to you. President Wilson said, "I certainly would not be one even to suggest that a man cease to love the home of his birth and the nation of his origin. But it is one thing to love the place where you were born, and it is another thing to dedicate yourself to the place to which you go. You cannot dedicate yourself to America unless you become in every respect and with every purpose of your will thorough Americans. Some Americans need hyphens in their name because only part of them has come over. But when the whole man has come over, heart and thought and all, the hyphen drops of its own weight out of his name." It's President Wilson speaking on hyphenated Americans. Now, if you think about this, he's referring to the sort of informal tradition of immigrant people, for example, to refer to themselves as, well, Irish American, German American, Italian American, Greek American, Russian American, etc., Jewish American. This hyphenated identity, in Wilson's mind at least, watered down the sort of meaning of Americanism, of what comes to be called during the war years 100% Americanism, as if there was no room for any other label on the marquee. But that goes beyond just mere aesthetics. I mean, Wilson is suggesting that somehow an individual weren't quite American enough if they continue to identify themselves by some other hyphenated label. Now, before we get too far with this, let's recognize something here. That as a nation of immigrants, and we often do boast of our heritage as a nation of immigrants. We saw that in the lecture on the Lower East Side, the famous words on the Statue of Liberty that invite basically the world's people, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, to America. But as a nation of immigrants, I think it's fair by any measure, any standard, to say that we don't like immigrants very much. or at least in some general sense, often find conflict with, with immigrant people and culture. And there's a long tradition of this in America, going all the way back to the beginnings of English settlement here in the Puritan colonies of New England, for example, where, though we are often taught as kids in grade school, the Pilgrims were here to establish religious freedom, it was not religious freedom that the Puritans were here to establish, unless we mean by that exclusive religious practice for their own members, because when other religionists, even those from England who, like the Pilgrims, were dissenting Protestants, found their way to New England, they were not welcomed. In the famous case of the Quakers, who came from England and who refused to abandon their religious practices when ordered to do so by the rulers of the Massachusetts colony, eventually faced execution, public execution. Mary Dyer was a woman hung for her religious beliefs. There's a statue to this day in Boston acknowledging that. Benjamin Franklin, one of the architects of American liberty, himself advocated, I guess, what we'd call an English as the official language ballot in Philadelphia in the 1750s. Alarmed by the growth of German-speaking immigrants to the Pennsylvania colony, Franklin felt that somehow the English identity of Pennsylvania was in jeopardy of being lost. As he put it, street signs were in German, newspapers were in German. He said that there would be a need for translators to tell one half of the Pennsylvania Assembly what the other half was saying because of the split between English and German speakers. So he put forward a vote in the Assembly calling on English to be the official language, and by one vote it passed. In the 19th century, Irish immigration inspired a backlash of nativism. The Irish, of course, had a conflicted history with the English, Irish Roman Catholics with English Protestants. And the arrival of so many Irish in the country in the mid-1800s inspired a nativist reaction that found its way right into the political system. Before there were the Jim Crow signs saying whites only, there were the No Irish Need Apply signs in this country, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, a secretive organization, a kind of forerunner to the Klan known as the Know-Nothings. Know-Nothings because they were secretive, and when asked, you were supposed to say as a member, I know nothing, not to give up any secrets. Well, the secret wasn't secret long because they formed themselves into a political party, gaining confidence, gaining influence, and ran candidates throughout the 1850s for state and even national office. The Know-Nothing or Nativist Party. And many other examples. By the 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the first to make it illegal to be in the United States without a basic processing. But that illegal concept is hung to specific immigrant groups ever since. And far more than its proponents often are willing to admit, illegal is pretty selectively applied in terms of public awareness, public backlash, and politics. As we all know today, when we speak of an illegal in the United States, we're talking, of course, about, Canadians, right? Yeah, everybody knows that. It's Canadians that we're targeting. So nativism, a fear of all things foreign. And you see here Uncle Sam standing at the gates of America holding his nose as this sort of wretched refuse of immigrant, coming in looking bedraggled and altogether unseemly. And if you look carefully, it says something on his back here, this barrel, it looks like a barrel of maybe alcohol or something, Sabbath desecration. And that was a sure sign that this person was understood to be Jewish. So, a wave of anti-immigrant, anti-foreign sentiment that we call nativism, a fear of all things foreign. Now, as America's neutrality in the war gave way to mobilization, America will enter the war in 1917, as you'll read in your textbook. Leaders were nervous about this issue of immigration and diversity, and looked quickly to the issue of loyalty. As Woodrow Wilson put it, it is not an army we must shape and train for a war. It is a nation. It is a nation. And so the theme of conformity, the theme of unity, will be now a central preoccupation of the federal government as America busies itself to enter the war in 1917. You see, the fear was that as a diverse nation, as a nation of immigrants, that it might not be possible for a single standard, a single unity to emerge. In other words, would German Americans really be willing to fight against Germany? Would Irish Americans be willing to fight with Protestant English troops? In other words, it wasn't clear that any single standard could be adhered to by such a diverse society as the United States. And so when Wilson says it's an army we must shape and train for a war, or excuse me, it's not an army, but rather a nation, he's talking about the conditioning of the public mood, bringing diverse interests into one single unified line. And I think as much as anything, that was one of the single most important reasons why America didn't declare war earlier. But once it happens, once America, the United States, declares war against Germany in April of 1917, the campaign for public conformity, the campaign to convince Americans to drop the hyphens from their names, as Wilson said, to conform to a single cultural, ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious standard was underway. And it was underway through an unprecedented blitz of propaganda and government regulations. As I said or suggested earlier, it's really World War I that gives rise to the birth of what we consider big government. When you consider that during the war, the government will spend 100 times the amount of money that it spent in previous decades. You get a real appreciation, for just how serious the government was at mobilizing the minds of the American people. One of the ways to do that was to demonize the enemy. This was a anti-German wartime poster. Destroy this mad brute, says a poster, enlist in the U.S. Army. And it shows a King Kong-like gorilla with a German helmet, a military helmet, and a club, a bloody club, with the word Kultur, Kultur, which is a German word for civilization. So a bloody club representing German civilization. The ruins in the background here of some destroyed city. And unmistakably, in the arms of the beast, essentially a damsel in distress. And who is this bare-chested, blonde-haired Grecian damsel but Liberty herself? And don't think that this didn't play on the sort of racial peculiarities of the American mindset in this age of Jim Crow. To see this guerrilla figure with this clearly Caucasian damsel representing liberty, this sort of rape fantasy that we had seen, in the culture of Jim Crow, is now manifest but directed against not African Americans but German Americans. An estimated 8 million German Americans who made up nearly, therefore, 1/10 of America's population. What we see in this process of anti-German, anti-immigrant, cultural excitement, organizations like the American Protective League. This is a civilian organization, a self-appointed civilian organization that comes to claim 250,000 members who they called agents, in over 600 cities of the country during World War I. The U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned this organization by allowing badges to be distributed to the agents. But what this really was, this organization as part of the preparedness, what was called preparedness for war, was an effort to get the American civilian population involved in reporting disloyalty, essentially ratting out your neighbors, spying on your neighbors, any evidence of disloyalty, particularly among immigrants. that you, as a conscientious, patriotic citizen, your duty was to to report these folks to the authorities, to the draft boards, to the local government, to the military, what have you. So the U.S. government will spend 3 times as much. I think I said 100 times as much earlier. I meant 3 times as much money in wartime mobilization as it did during the first 100 years of our country's history. The Selective Service Act, for example, required young men of a certain age to register for the draft. The fear being that if we relied upon the American tradition of voluntarism in an unpopular war, and in many respects, World War I was unpopular. We had proclaimed ourselves neutral from the outset. There was no great sentiment in the part of the American public. I think there was a bitter taste in the mouth of many Americans coming out of the Spanish-American and particularly Philippine insurrection. So, yeah, the government decided take no chances. We'll make it a federal law that says a young man of a certain age has to sign up for the Selective Service Act. 24 million do so, and eventually 3 million are drafted. So no risking of disloyalty here. It was a federal imperative, and if you didn't sign up and if you were drafted but didn't go, you were subject to imprisonment. And there were scores and really hundreds and a kind of spiral of draft resistance and draft dodging, if you will, that landed many American young men, many a dissenter, I should say, in prison. Some cases in federal prison, like Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So a serious effort by the government now to coerce military participation. Wartime agencies created by the federal government, in fact, managed almost every aspect of the war, and that meant almost every aspect of American life during the war, from the U.S. Food Administration to the War Industries Board to the Committee on Public Information. These were all federal agencies, and there was really no tradition. The only federal agency we've spoken of, for example, is the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. So there was no great tradition of creating federal agencies to carry out, basic tasks in American life. Government was small. As recently as the 1890s, the federal government had run budget surpluses. It's not often we hear that phrase these days, budget surpluses. That is, the government took in more money than it spent. It didn't have much to do. But by World War I, the ratcheting up of wartime mobilization now and regulation of American economy. Think about the Food Administration, the War Industries Board. These were agencies designed to make the economy, the traditionally free market, private enterprise economy in America, produce for the war. In other words, not allowing or taking the chance that producers would put profit before patriotism, but instead using federal government authority to coerce farmers, in the case of the Food Administration, to produce crops at certain prices to supply the Army. The War Industries Board to organize the leading industries in America, including the steel industry, the automobile industry, to turn their production over now to wartime production, to agree upon prices, to agree upon wages, to forestall any labor strikes. This is what the federal government is now doing. And the Committee on Public Information, pure and simple, a propaganda agency to wage the war in the hearts and minds of the American people, for wartime support, wartime loyalty, wartime conformity, etc. The handiwork of the CPI, as it was known most famously here in the poster, the classic poster of Uncle Sam, the wartime artist James Montgomery Flagg. His name was actually Flagg, how appropriate. James Montgomery Flagg used himself as the model for the new and improved and rather stern now Uncle Sam. The man Wilson appointed to head up the CPI was a longtime newspaperman by the name of George Creel. And Creel had a knack for public influence and public opinion. And as he put it, it was a plain publicity proposition, a vast enterprise in salesmanship, the world's greatest adventure in advertising. That's how he described the Committee on Public Information's wartime job, to sell the war to the American people. A popular song in 1915 was, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. It was a neutral sentiment, an isolationist sentiment, an anti-war sentiment. But the job of Creel and others was to erase that sentiment and instead create a wartime sentiment, a pro-war sentiment, by selling the war. And how does one sell a war to the American people? Well, you hire experts in advertising, experts in print and media. You hire orators. 750,000 speeches commissioned by the so-called 4-minute men during war. These were government hired speakers who, on a moment's notice at almost anywhere, a schoolyard, a church, a park, a busy street corner in a city, could mount the platform and give a rousing patriotic speech in 4 minutes or less. 750,000 speeches commissioned during the 18 months or so America was in a war. Do not let the German spy hear and report that you are a slacker, read one of the sort of template speeches read by or given by the government paid patriotic orator. Patriotic songs. It wasn't just speeches. If you get folks singing on behalf of the war, you could get them certainly, I think, supporting it. George M. Cohen, who was a civilian songwriter, the so-called Tin Pan Alley songwriter, wrote pop tunes, basically pop hits, turned his talents now to catchy wartime numbers like Over There. The famous chorus, over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. It's hard not to sing this song. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun. This was a marching song, but marching civilian. It was a parade song. And it, as I say, it sort of changed the tone and temper from the popular song of 1915, which was I Don't Want My Boy to Be a Soldier Now, to Over There, a rousing call for Americans to go to Europe and fight in the Great War. So highly did the Congress think of George M. Cohen's efforts that after the war he was voted the Congressional Medal of Honor, voted to a civilian songwriter the nation's highest military award, George M. Cohen. There's a movie that Hollywood did several years later starring Jimmy Cagney called Yankee Doodle Dandy that tells the story of Cohen. Even Hollywood gets in on the act now. Hollywood movies promoting a patriotic support for the war. America's Answer, you see, here typical of such movies. But notice, presented by Division of Films, Committee on Public Information, George Creel, chairman. So even co-opting Hollywood into the role of patriotic film maker. And for the visual learners in the country, the CPI wallpapered the towns and cities with patriotic posters. Patriotic posters that we saw earlier were successful in demonizing the enemy. Think about this now. We say demonizing the enemy. We're not talking simply about rendering the enemy in unflattering terms or disparaging the enemy or saying tacky things about the enemy, but demonizing the enemy, depicting the enemy as subhuman, as pure evil. Let's take a look at this. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. Again, getting Americans to buy Liberty bonds. The Hun in blood red letters showing the evil silhouetted outline of the German soldier. Now, Germans weren't Huns. Huns, Hungarians, Asiatic people at the time of the Roman Empire inspired fear in Rome. Beat back the Hun becomes now a kind of symbol for the German menace. This looks purely evil, this image. No wonder it inspired George Lucas to create for his character Darth Vader the silhouetted image of the German soldier from the wartime propaganda. Before we get to that, let me say one more thing. The problem with demonizing the enemy in a popular sense is that if you're too successful at it, then the fear and hatred and loathing of the German soldier easily translates into fear, hatred, and loathing of all German people, including German Americans here in the United States. And we're going to see in a minute how there is indeed a backlash against German Americans. All right, but if you can't sell people by scaring the wits out of them, ladies, what can you always get a guy to do? Well, sex appeal. Seduce them through patriotic sex appeal. And it's true. Howard Chandler Christie, one of the poster artists whose work you see here, used sex appeal in the Victorian age. Gee, I wish I were a man, she says. I'd join the Navy, be a man, and do it. I'll let your imaginations cover this. I want you for the Navy, said another Christie poster. Now, it seems all like something almost fantastical, if not downright hilarious, but it was deadly serious, and the consequences were there for all to see. This sort of hysterically, sort of government-produced wartime patriotism on demand. I mentioned the anti-German backlash. Here you see a delicatessen butcher shop owned by an F. Mueller, so presumably a German American, has been gutted. It's been the windows have been broken out. There's a kind of a crowd of people out looking at it, and there were reports of violence, popular public violence. In the nation that brought you lynching, it's not hard to imagine how mobs of people could set upon a German butcher shop. And what was his crime? That he spoke English with a little too heavily accented, or that he, had been a little too proud of his German identity, that he hadn't demonstrably come over to the American cause by emptying his savings account and buying Liberty bonds. I mean, who knows? But the nativist backlash was strict and often violent. And the government plays its part in this. Listen to William Gibbs McAdoo, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He's talking about the Liberty Loan, this wartime bond sales, and he says, every person who refused to subscribe, or who takes the attitude of let the other fellow do it, is a friend of Germany, and I would like nothing better than to tell it to him to his face. A man who can't lend his government $1.25 per week at a rate of 4% interest is not entitled to be an American citizen. So some tough talk there from McAdoo, suggesting, I think, publicly, that there was a litmus test for what it meant to be an American, and if you failed that test, then clearly you were to be held in contempt and suspicion by your fellow citizens. And so, yes, there was popular pressure put on people, but in the end, the federal government wasn't willing to rely on that. The Congress will pass the Espionage Act in 1917, and part of that bill stated that anyone who willfully caused or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, that such a person be subject to prosecution for violating the federal law. In other words, what this got down to is anybody who wrote anything, and particularly anybody who wrote something and tried to use the U.S. mail system to distribute or disseminate it, say anti-war, propaganda or something, you were subject to federal prosecution. The post office, the postmaster general could open your mail, could inspect its contents, and if you were found in violation of the law, then you could be prosecuted. The following year, the Sedition Act was passed by Congress in 1918. Targeting all, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language against the Constitution, flag, government, or military uniform. So broadening the net here to include anyone who might give a speech or say something publicly that would be critical of the war or the government. Now, the federal government, meant business here. Over 1,500 prosecutions during the war of those charged with violating either the Sedition Act or the Espionage Act. Now, one of those who did, and one who you're going to be reading about this week for your discussion board assignment, was this man, Eugene Victor Debs of Indiana. He was born in America, in the heartland of Indiana, came up believing in the American dream, worked his way at a young age into the railroad, admired the men who owned the Vandalia Railroad in his native Terre Haute, Indiana, wanted to be just like them until the great crash of 1877, the great economic disaster of 1877, convince Eugene Debs that in industrial capitalism that the cards were stacked against the American worker. He became involved in the railway union, the American Railway Union, and was there at Pullman in Chicago in the 1894 when the Great Pullman Strike incited violence at the Pullman Railroad Yards in Illinois. He was the organizer of this strike and was jailed afterwards. And while in jail, determined that to change the laws, to create some sort of support for the working people of the country, he would have to become not a revolutionary but a politician. And so joined the American Socialist Party, and over the next 2 decades became the leading candidate of that party for president of the United States, and ran on a number of occasions. Even Gene Debs's political foes acknowledged that he was a genuine guy, an honest guy, a man of integrity, who believed that in America there were certain vital interests that were too important to be left to the vagaries of the marketplace. But when World War I came around, Debs, like other American socialists, quickly came out against the war. He says here in his speech in Canton, Ohio in 1918, "They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war, and strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people." It was during that speech delivered on the stump in Canton in 1918 that Debs will get hung up on a federal prosecution rap. Stenographers who were in the audience took down notes, turned state's evidence. Debs is arrested, charged with violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and put on trial in federal court. He is convicted and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for the violation of the wartime acts. Despite his impassioned defense during his trial that he was no different really than Adams and Jefferson, Washington and Paine during the American Revolution. Had they been arrested by England, they would have been charged with treason. But his argument did not move the court. The court found Debs guilty. 10 years, the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. It didn't kill his spirit, because in 1920, from his jail cell, Debs mounted his final presidential campaign and won, in fact, over 1 million votes. His sentence was later commuted by President Harding, and in poor health by that point, Debs was released from prison and died soon afterwards. Now, Debs's case was one of, as I say, over 1,500 prosecuted by the government during the war. Ultimately, one of them, a case called Schenck versus United States from 1919, found its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had a chance to rule on the constitutionality of wartime laws that would prohibit basic civil liberties like free speech, free press, that sort of thing. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who you see here, himself a veteran of the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg, Justice Holmes ruled in the majority opinion of the court when he said the question in every case is whether the words used in such circumstances are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger, that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. The clear and present danger to the safety of the country was now the litmus test. As Holmes famously said, the First Amendment right of free speech was not all-encompassing. If you were to walk into a crowded movie theater, for example, and yell "fire," shout "fire," when in fact there was no fire, causing a panic and a trampling, you would not claim the right of free speech. You would be guilty of inciting a riot. And so, said Justice Holmes, those who spoke out against the war, who spoke out against the draft, who criticized the government, were in effect inspiring riotous behavior and potential chaos, undermining the safety of the country. And so the court upheld the wartime prosecutions of Schenck and Debs and the many others who now had been ensnared in this nativist backlash during the war. All right, so that's the end now of part one, the lecture part one. We'll come back next week and look at nativism after the war. in the 1920s. All right, everybody, thanks.